Hello, everyone, and welcome to this introduction to this week's podcast. Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. You know, it's always great to have her. I really admire her. We've become really close friends. We talk before and after the recording about everything about our historian friends, about things we both want to read, things we want to investigate. I ask her questions. She asks me questions. We actually agree about almost everything, but we play bitter enemies on TV. She's great, and I love having her, and you all love her. She's a terrific young scholar, and she's so funny, whimsical, and playful, and uses language that no proper historian would ever use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I really like her a lot, and we've become really close over the years. So all that. Now, we talked today about foreign policy of the founders, and the reason we did that, of course, is because the United States has snatched the president of Venezuela and his wife and brought them to New York and arraigned them. Think of what the founding fathers would think about that. Are sending a military sortie into the capital of another sovereign nation without congressional consultation of any sort and without congressional authorization, when the Constitution very, 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 very clearly says that all wars must begin in the House of Representatives, that the House must pay for it, that the president does not have any independent authority unless we are under attack. And surely no one can really argue that we were under attack by Venezuela. That is sophistry of the worst sort. I get it that this is not 1787. I get that this is not the Jefferson administration. I get that we have long since eroded the constitutional war powers cautionary notes, but the founding fathers would be appalled by this. And guess why? Because presidents don't pay for wars, the people do. Presidents don't fight wars, the sons and now daughters of people do. And therefore, since this is something that the people pay for and the people do, the authority must begin in the legislative body under our tripartite system, not the executive, not the judiciary, but the legislative body, the Congress. And of the two houses of Congress, it's the House, because the House is closest to the people. And that's why the founders had the House on a 2-year leash, so that if the House does something dangerously wrong, the people can repudiate it and retire such people and put people in the next round that are more in keeping with the actual will of the people, the will of the sovereign. So much fun to talk with Lindsay. We recorded this today on the 5th of January. I'm looking out at sun. The sidewalks are melting a little. We've had some snow over the last few weeks. I leave on Friday for Missoula and Locksaw Lodge, where I'm doing 2 back-to-back humanities retreats. The first one on the West, and the second one on novels by Cormac McCarthy, or maybe it's the other way around, but one on McCarthy's 4 of his novels, and one on Jefferson and the West, which is a subject, I spent a lot of time thinking about. And then I'm starting to plan for next year's retreats, but you can come to France. We want you to come to France at the end of September. Jefferson's France, 2026. That's going to be a wonderful, wonderful trip. We may have a few places left on the Lewis and Clark tour for next summer. We're planning a Grand Canyon tour in the fall, in August of 2027. Online courses. I just finished conducting the best online course of the whole series I've done since the pandemic. This one was on the vulnerabilities and flashpoints of the U.S. Constitution. The next one, which will be coming in February, March, will be on what would it take to actually have a constitutional convention? How would you have representation? Are there algorithms that could give us a true sample? Can you even do this in an age of 24/7, 365 media and lobbyists and all of that? Freedom of Information Acts. How would you train such people? Would it be binding or non-binding? Can you sequester people for 2 months to do something like this? Would you pay them? Would there be constitutional consultants? Who knows? But other nations have done it, and other nations have done it successfully. And then the third course, the first one was just this fall, the vulnerabilities. The second one is the mechanics. So what would the mechanics look like in the logistics? And the third one will be an actual little model convention where we will look at the most important clauses, the ones that need the most clarification from war powers and pardons and emoluments and impeachment to the Second Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Fourth Amendment. What is a cruel and unusual punishment? What is an establishment of religion? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All things that desperately need clarification in the 21st century. And that'll be coming up in April. So those are coming up. You can see them all at ltamerica.org. All sorts of things. Also, you should join the Friends group at the level that you're willing to support and join the book club. And we have Zoom meetings every quarter. Oof, I'm exhausted just even outlining all these things. So just wanted you to know, let's go to the show. But do please support us in any way you feel comfortable, because we do need your help in order to do all the wonderful things. The Airstream is in storage, but it'll be coming out here in about 8 weeks. So I can't wait because I miss it, my friends. Let us go to the show. Hello, everyone, and Happy New Year, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson, and across from me is our favorite guest, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, back by popular demand. Everywhere I go, they browbeat me and say, more Lindsay, less Clay, which is fine. I guess I'm wounded, but I can take it, Lindsay. So Happy New Year to you. Happy New Year to you. You're, of course, the executive director of the GW, the George Washington Presidential Library. You appear to be in that office today.
I'm actually in my home office today. I am trying a new thing in 2026 where I'm trying to block out a little bit of time for deep work because...
Good luck, my friend. Good luck.
Can't even get the sentence out. So I was in the office earlier and then I came home for this, and the hope is that I can then get some work done afterward.
Without revealing any private information, how long is the commute?
About 20 minutes.
Not bad at all. So I didn't see that you were at home because, of course, you're surrounded by books wherever you go.
Correct.
But I'm glad to talk with you. And, of course, we meet at a really important moment. Our theme.
Well, I should say, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the way you would have known that I was at home is had I turned down my computer and you would have seen who is next to me.
I was about to mention that Quincy, your faithful dog, sometimes plays a role on this program, is with you. I just saw a tail wag behind you, so that's great. All right. Foreign policy in the age of the Founding Fathers, foreign policy in the early national period. And of course, there's a reason that we chose this topic, because we're recording this on the 5th of January, 2026, the 250th birthday of the United States. And we, over the weekend, have invaded a sovereign other nation in the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela, and snatched up its president and his spouse and brought them to New York City for trial. They have been arraigned and pleaded not guilty to the crimes which we allege of drug trafficking and so on and so forth. This is something that's really raising the eyebrows of our allies around the world, including in NATO and many people in this country. And it really, Lindsay, raises the question of war powers under the American Constitution. So let's start there. So I made a list of 10 things. Let me just quickly go through it. Your man Washington and the Nootka crisis. I will explain that. George Washington and the French Revolution. Of course, Jefferson was his Secretary of State, so he's involved in both of those. Of course, the famous farewell address of George Washington when he finally got his retirement to go under his vine and his fig tree briefly. John Adams and the French crisis, the undeclared naval war, the Quasi-War of 1798 and 99. Then new President Jefferson and the North African pirates. Jefferson and the embargo against Britain and France in 1807, 1808, and 1809. Jefferson's sort of platform letter that he wrote in 1799 to his friend Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. Then Mr. Madison's War, as they called it, the War of 1812. And then number 9, should we consider our relations with Native Americans foreign policy? And finally, can history help us think about the current Venezuelan crisis? Let's get at it, my friend. So George Washington had, of course, was going unanimously to be the first president of the United States. Everyone reckoned that the minute he turned up at the Constitutional Convention. That was a foregone conclusion. I think even he knew this. And he had to set the tone. But the Constitution makers, as you know, worked very, very hard to kennel the dogs of war. They believed that war should be the last melancholy resort of a free republic after every possible other option had been exhausted, and then and only then with the greatest hesitation, and that it must be started by Congress. And in fact, it must really begin in the House of Representatives, because that was the body that was closest to the people. you see what this meant. Why were they so insistent upon this, Lindsay?
Well, this was very much a product of their experience with monarchical institutions. Kings had full war powers, which meant two things. They could send armies at will to engage in often centuries-long dynastic squabbles, regardless of whether or not it was a good idea or in the nation's best interest. This has been, of course, made famous by, King Henry VIII really wanted to be a great warrior king like his father. And so he sent armies into battle all the time, even if there was no likely outcome that was positive. But that also had an enormous financial implication for the nation, which was that they would then have to pay for these armies. And war was expensive then, just like it was now. And when the king's government was basically the entirety of the budget, that meant that funding these wars was a huge part of what a nation did. And Parliament in England, and to a lesser extent in France and Spain and other nations, wanted to have a role in whether or not they would be sending armies places and spending enormous amounts of money, and therefore having to raise taxes or duties or some form of tribute.
One of the great principles of the Enlightenment was that wars must begin with the sovereign, with the people, and they should not be the work of caprice by a single powerful individual, that there had to be a vetting process, and that the body of the people who's going to have to serve in those wars and pay for those wars must be at the center of those deliberations. And as you know, the founders in Philadelphia also said that Congress, and particularly the House of Representatives, has the power of the purse, so that it can cut off any war that it doesn't want being fought, because a president, at least then, cannot spend money that he doesn't have.
Yes, and in theory, Great Britain had actually started this process. As Parliament gained more authority, they did have more of the power of the purse. Now, that system was complicated because the Privy Council, in theory, was sort of the governing operation, but it was often at the pleasure of the king. And so the king still had an enormous amount of authority. And so the framers at the Constitutional Convention brought this context in. They did not want the president to be solely in charge of war, which is the reason that Congress has the power to declare war. It's pretty unambiguous, and there are a lot of things in the Constitution that are quite ambiguous. This is not one of them.
This is not one of them. And so to jump way forward just for a moment, we'll only take a second on this. The Founding Fathers wanted to make sure that a president or any other single entity could not start a war without it going through the people's branch of government, that the people's branch must pay for it and raise the taxes for it, must be consulted, and it must approve of that war. Of course, the president, as the commander-in-chief, has the right to defend this country with imminent invasion. But after the Nixon debacle, Congress passed the War Powers Act that said the president has like 60 days before he must come to Congress. So that's where things stand. I think it's fair to say the Founding Fathers would be aghast by what just happened with respect to Venezuela.
Well, I think they would be aghast at a lot of things. It's maybe an understatement.
Really? Make the list, would you?
I think what's interesting is the distinction they drew between the actual act of fighting the war, which is why you have one person as the commander in chief, because
once you fund.
Yeah, once you have decided that war should take place, you need to have quick, decisive decision making on the battlefield. So you do need one person. You can't have a collective decision. And I think that is a efficiency that we still all recognize, and why we have evolved it slightly to give presidents a window in which they can take action before going to Congress. Over the last 2.5 decades, the war powers have become quite fuzzy. And this, we have talked about this before. I know we've done programs on war powers, but largely this was initially in response to 9/11. There was a massive grant of authority to the executive branch, and Congress has tried to claw it back a little bit in certain ways or make limitations in certain ways, but they have never fully overturned their war powers grant to the executive. And so the executive does have authority to basically engage in war that the founders would have never envisioned.
And you said something very important there. So in the age of Jefferson, Washington, Adams, Madison, Monroe, the founders understood that once the war has been declared, you have to give the commander almost exclusive right to prosecute it. And of course, this partly came out of the experience of our Revolutionary War, when George Washington was increasingly frustrated by Congress wanting to deliberate and get in the way and talk about strategy and so on. And he basically said, you can't do it that way. Once you do it, Congress has to be the center of it. But once you've declared it and funded it, you have to mostly get out of the way so that we can actually win the war using military strategy, not having long debates in Congress.
Yes, absolutely. And, there was an innovation in that Congress eventually created a board of war. So that was a little bit more centralized to serve as a form of oversight, but it was still frustrating. And he often felt tied in terms of making the battlefield decisions until they were very clear to him and basically said, do whatever you think is best on the battlefield, and then we will circle back to it. And that's what Congress has basically done. They have given, in periods of war, they have given presidents enormous authority to do what they think is best, and then they will practice oversight. And they do that. And they practice oversight through funding. They practiced oversight through the change of regulations for armed forces. That is a power of Congress. They have practiced oversight through the reorganization of the various departments. Congress creates the departments through legislation, and if we just get to decide our titles, then I would like to be the queen of the library and all things books, but I don't think that's how the world
all right, so
works.
Now, just I'm a lot older than you are, as you make clear every time we talk, so thanks a lot for that. But I lived through Vietnam, and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was sort of a cooked-up resolution over a cooked-up affair. And then it was used by the Johnson administration as almost a blank check for whatever it wanted to do in Vietnam. And because of the debacle of Vietnam, when the war was unwinnable after 1968, 69, 70, Congress began to say, we're going to cut off the funds. They were going to cut off the funds for it because they have the right to do that. And that's what precipitated the Nixon administration to finally close it out, because if they hadn't done it, Congress was just going to say no more.
Correct. And under the Constitution, that is appropriate congressional oversight. Congress funds everything. And so if Congress doesn't like what the executive is doing, they can deprive it of money to do it.
And much of that was actually worked out during Gerald Ford's brief presidency after Nixon resigned. All right, so let's go back. Tell me if you think this is fair. Jefferson believed that if there had been no Hamilton, Washington would generally have sided with him, Jefferson, but that Washington was so enamored, so dedicated to Hamilton and Hamilton's great mind, that he was persuaded more often to take Hamilton's side than Jefferson was comfortable with. But Jefferson believed that Washington, as a fellow Virginian, as a fellow planter, as a fellow farmer, instinctively was more Jeffersonian than he later became because of circumstances. Pragmatic events destroy any idealism, and because of Hamilton's extraordinary persuasiveness.
That's a very long answer. Should I answer it after we take a break?
You could just say, yes, Clay, you're always right, or you could say, I'll answer that after the break.
No.
Okay. All right.
I will tell you why Jefferson is wrong after the break.
No, I would be the wrong one. But anyway, we're going to take a short break. I'm talking to the lovely, the wonderful, the brilliant, the heckling, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Will be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America, Foreign Policy in the Age of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. Lindsay, before we went to break, I made the case that Jefferson believed that Washington was really mostly with him, an instinctive Jeffersonian small r Republican, and that Washington was sort of persuaded, or as Jefferson thought, seduced by Hamilton. You're saying not so.
No, I think that may have been true in the 1750s, maybe 1760s, but by the end of the war, Washington had a nationalist perspective that many of the other officers in the Continental Army shared with him. That was born of a truly national experience. Not only had he traveled from Boston to the South and then back again, and had seen Americans of all different stripes in those various different states, but had understood the essentialness of a national government because Congress had been so ineffective. And while Jefferson certainly served as governor and then as a diplomat, he didn't experience the hardships firsthand of what it meant when Congress didn't do its job. And of course, he hadn't traveled up and down the nation in that same way.
And he'd never been a military commander, didn't really understand military affairs.
Yes. So by 1783, at the end of the war, Washington and Hamilton actually agreed on far more than Washington and Jefferson would have agreed on. And I think that even if you took Jefferson and Hamilton, their personalities out of the equation, Washington was looking for people that were on the poles of the different ideas about where the nation could go, because he wanted to triangulate between them. And so he would have sought out more extreme positions in both directions, regardless of who they were.
All right. So back to the Nootka crisis. Turns out it petered out. The Spanish and the British decided, we'll just like share the port. Everybody, it's going to be okay. Well, it's not worth going to war over. And so what at first seemed like it was going to be a really huge and fundamental American crisis in foreign policy turned out to just kind of dissipate. Is that fair?
Yeah, it turned into nothing, which was good because Washington had plenty of other foreign policy crises to deal with later.
So I'm wanting to go to the French Revolution and its impact on this country. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Tell us about this. So the French Revolution occurs. Jefferson was there at the beginning. He saw the Bastille stormed, or at least heard about it. Comes back in 1789. And for the rest of his life, he thought it was probably going to end in a benign formation of a republic, sort of on the lines of the British parliamentary system, and maybe eventually as far as our idealism in our republic. And he never really admitted, except once to John Adams, that he had been wrong about the whole thing and that it got much more awful, violent, more nightmarish. Adams was right. Jefferson was wrong. Adams really crowed in triumph when Jefferson had to admit that. But this created not just a crisis in foreign affairs, but a crisis at home, because the revolution bled back into the politics of the United States. So pick it up from there.
It did. And I love the way that you set that up, because I think for us as Americans today, we live in this big, powerful, very wealthy nation where we're going to talk more about this, really throw our weight and power around. And so what happens across the globe often feels quite distant and maybe not particularly relevant to our day to day. So Americans don't really pay attention to foreign policy, and they don't really pay attention to global affairs. There are all these studies that show, like people in Switzerland know who the American president is and who senators are. And we, of course, generally don't know who their heads of state are. And I include myself in that.
Or our own sometimes.
Well, that's true, too. I include myself in that. I consider myself to be pretty well-read and well-educated, and yet my knowledge of what happens in foreign nations is not maybe what it should be. That was not true.
Churchill still the Prime Minister of Britain?
Sometimes I would like him to be, but no,
okay. Go ahead.
That is particularly important in the 1790s because Americans were paying very close attention to what happened in France and Great Britain in particular, because they were sort of, friends, allies, enemies, big trade partners. And the French Revolution was initially such an exciting moment because it seemed like they were going to be the sister republic, these ideas.
Vindicate our own and take it further.
Yes, they were going to demonstrate the power of these ideas, and that they weren't just an American experience, but rather a global experience.
Or as Jefferson put it, the little flame that we lit on the 4th of July, 1776, was going to engulf all the tyrannies of the world, and they would all eventually become like us.
And so they were really excited. And so you would see Americans all over the place wearing these tricolor rosettes, what were called cockades. And they were these little rose-looking flowers that were 3 colors, blue, white, and red, in honor of the French Revolution.
Solidarity buttons.
Yes, exactly. And it was a way to demonstrate it was both your patriotism, but also your sister loyalty to revolutionary ideas. That quickly shifted when the French Revolution rapidly became much more violent than most Americans were comfortable with. And not violent in the way that the American Revolution was violent, in that you had basically 2 nations or aspiring nations fighting against one another, but widespread executions of French people without any due process in a way that felt quite arbitrary and capricious.
This led to a war between Britain and France, eventually a world war. And the Washington administration, with its teeny tiny cabinet, had to decide what our policy would be. And Jefferson believed, as Secretary of State, someone who had lived in France, believed that we owed it to France to essentially side with them because they had aided us through the revolution in 1778. We had signed a treaty of perpetual amity and friendship. And so our duty was, at least if we're going to be neutral, we should lean French. And that didn't prevail.
Yes. And so the split in the cabinet was reflected a widespread split in the nation, in that the Federalists were generally distrustful of the French Revolution, and they were more pro-British in this conflict, although I should say no one really wanted to join the war. It was just kind of where you fell on the spectrum. And the Democratic Republicans were more pro-French. They were a little bit more tolerant of the excesses of the French Revolution. And as you said, with neutrality, it was how you interpreted it. A strict neutrality was going to benefit Great Britain. A looser neutrality was going to benefit France. And Jefferson wanted a looser neutrality. Hamilton wanted a stricter neutrality, and they kind of battled it out. And this is where I think sometimes the story gets it wrong, because people will say, oh, Jefferson wanted Washington to enter the war on behalf of France.
No,
very much not so. Everyone agreed entering the war would be a terrible, terrible idea. It was just a question of, were you going to kind of turn a blind eye and do sort of a wink, wink, nod, nod situation when the French were doing things in American ports that were very obviously war activities?
And what do we owe to France, given our deep gratitude for, France's decisive role in the revolution, including at Yorktown? And so I understand why Jefferson wanted to lean slightly towards the French, but everyone needs to know, as you said earlier, we were not a colossus in this era. We were a fragile, upstart republic. Lucky we had a 3,000-mile moat between us and all of that, but nobody wanted to get ground up in any of that. And the question is we're going to bounce forward here in a minute, because the French, when we didn't help them, became bitter about this. And this comes back to haunt the Adams administration. But before we go there, everyone who's studied this at any length knows that there was something called the Genet affair, that the French sent a kind of a young, radical, loudmouth puppy named Edmund Genet, and he came here and then he started to, he disliked Washington's response to him, although it was Washington's response to him at first was respectful. But Genet then decided he was going to go over the head of the American president and whip up American support for the French Revolution. And at that point, even Jefferson, who was now deeply embarrassed for having embraced Genet, a real setback for the emerging small R Republican Party, even Jefferson realizes, oh boy, we've got to cut our losses with this guy, and he is recalled. But he gets to stay in the United States thanks to George Washington.
Yes. Genet was probably one of the all-time worst diplomats, like a just terribly suited personality for diplomacy. He really thought that the Americans were going to be very enthusiastic. And to be fair to him, when he first arrived, I believe he arrived in Charleston, and he was treated like a conquering hero, and he was celebrated and he was feted. And so he had every reason to think that maybe this would be the case, and then made his way to Philadelphia, flaunting, all forms of diplomatic protocol, and presented himself. And initially, of course, it was fine, as you said, and Washington was respectful. He ended up not going back to the United States because at this point,
wait. He ended up not going back to France.
Thank you. He ended up not going back to France because there had been another change in the ruling party in France. And had he gone back, he would have been executed.
They might have lopped off his head.
Yes. And so Washington gave him a reprieve, said he could stay. He ended up marrying the daughter of Governor Clinton, who was the governor of New York, moved to upstate New York, and then became a farmer. And no one ever really heard from him again. He was very quiet.
So one of the things he did, which forced us to demand his recall, he fitted out a privateer in one of our harbors, changed the name to the Petite Liberté, and was going to use it to attack the British. And Jefferson said, you can't be fitting out ships for war in our harbors. We're willing to tolerate a fair amount of activity, but that would be a provocation against Britain, which we might really wind up regretting.
Well, it's even worse than that, because he had fitted out several privateers, but this ship in particular had been a British ship that French privateers had captured, dragged back into the port of Philadelphia. And Jefferson had said, under no circumstances can you arm it, and under no circumstances can you leave. And he did both of those things. And what's important to note is that the port of Philadelphia, when I do presentations on this, I have a map of Philadelphia at the time, which I love, and it has a star where it shows where the port is. And 6 blocks west is the star where the president's house is. It didn't particularly go unnoticed by President Washington. It didn't particularly go unnoticed by Jefferson, and it didn't particularly go unnoticed by the British minister who also lived in Philadelphia, who then went to Jefferson and said, excuse me, what is happening here? And that was when they requested.
So Philadelphia is then the capital of the United States. So he didn't fit this out in Norfolk. He didn't fit this out in New York Harbor. He didn't fit this out in Boston. He fit it out within blocks of the center of the American government.
Yes.
All right. So he's recalled, but he gets to stay in New York, marries a Clinton, goes utterly quiet, never really heard from again. And the crisis is not over. Now, just to make sure that I beat up on my man Jefferson here, he was so enamored of the idea of liberty with a capital L that he made his most ridiculous, radical statement ever to his protege, William Short, who had stayed in France after Jefferson returned as a minor American official. And Jefferson got a letter from Short saying, this reign of terror is really a horrible, horrible nightmare and bloodbath. Some of your friends are being torn out of carriages and torn literally limb from limb if they're not guillotined. And Jefferson wrote the famous letter in which he said, rather than that this revolution would have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. If there were one Adam and one Eve alive in every nation and alive free, that would be better than at present. So he's willing to reduce the 2 billion population of the world to one Adam and one Eve. They will regenerate the world in terms of liberty. Talk about a really irresponsible, it was a private letter, of course, but a really irresponsible, nutty thing for Jefferson to say.
It's the kind of thing that I don't think you say if you've actually I was going to say that it's the kind of thing that you say if you've never actually really experienced bloodshed. But he was in Paris when the early violence broke out. He was in Paris when people were strung up from light lampposts. And so I think that and of course, this is the same person who, when he lost one family member, was so distraught and just horrifically upset and went into deep and dark depressions, which I think are some of his better qualities. And yet he's able to compartmentalize what it feels like for a person to feel their own grief with imposing that grief on others. Well,
Jefferson, just to make the case for him, although it can't really be made, he believed that nothing was more important than liberty, that the old world had really fouled this up, had made a hash out of the human experiment, tyranny, dictatorships, endless wars, class systems, and that we had it in our power, as Thomas Paine said, to start the world over again here in the United States. This was humanity's best, maybe last chance to get it right, which always breaks my heart to think about it. And that he thought that the French Revolution, including the Reign of Terror, which round up about 30,000, we think, was what he would have called a necessary bloodletting. And he said, what's your proportionality here? Think of the oppressions on average French people over millennia. He said, okay, so a couple of tens of thousands of really rich, privileged people get destroyed. It doesn't seem like that's not acceptable in search of liberty. And I think you can understand that, but it's so ideologically touched that it seems inhuman at times.
There is a certain element that I understand of you maybe have to go through a certain amount of pain to reshape a system. But I do think that is very detached from what that lived reality actually looks like.
Well, in a slightly less crazy mode, he said the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That is its natural manure. So we're still with the Washington administration. Do you have another instance of his 2 terms that you'd like to speak about, or just go to his farewell address?
Well, I think there are 2 quick details that are folded into the end of this moment. So as the French relationship is starting to fray a bit, Washington sent John Jay, who was the Chief Justice, to Great Britain was the Chief Justice. Gosh, it is the first day back from vacation and my brain's not working quite like it should.
Never tell that to the public.
It's good. We're all human. We all make mistakes.
Even you?
Always me. So he was the Chief Justice of the United States. He went to Great Britain. He signed a new treaty. It was called the Jay Treaty for his name. It infuriated the French. It's one of the things that led to the tensions in the Adams administration, which I know we will get to. Washington also signed a new treaty with Spain called the Pinckney Treaty, which was supposed to guarantee access for American farmers and merchants to the Mississippi River.
Which it did for a while.
Which it did, but it was imperfectly applied.
So Washington is a very savvy and shrewd diplomat, and he had what we would call a benign form of realpolitik. He understood the world He understood that nations operate out of interest, not out of idealism, and that however grateful we might feel to Lafayette and all the great French patriots who'd come to help us, and gratitude to the French nation, we had to mind our own best self-interest as a nation and make pragmatic decisions about these things and not get caught in some sort of romantic effusions. And I'm sure that really annoyed him about Jefferson, and who was an ideologue. And I think it probably made him more friendly to Hamilton's views, because Hamilton's views were essentially identical, although Hamilton said our best bet is to cling as closely as possible to the British models because they're the big economy of the world, and why would we ever want to be at odds with them? So Jay makes this treaty. He's burned an effigy up and down the country for this. Turns out, when I started working on Jefferson 40 years ago, the Jay Treaty was kind of seen as a big mistake, but more recently it's been seen as a really good treaty because the British did finally abandon the forts that they were keeping on the upper Mississippi Basin and the Great Lakes. It regularized our trade and allowed us to move on and as co-trading nations. The Jeffersonians were bitter because it didn't allow compensation for the slaves that had liberated themselves and wound up with the British fleets as the British left this hemisphere. I hate it when slavery winds up distorting the picture, but here it does again. The Southerners were very upset about that, but they hadn't paid their bills either. They hadn't paid the bills they owed British merchants. And so the Jay Treaty wasn't perfect, but it allowed these two nations, one the most powerful nation in the world and the biggest economy, the other this fragile fledgling nation, but cousin nation, to get along well enough to move forward. But Jefferson was appalled that George Washington would even sign such a treaty.
Yes, I agree with all of that. One other thing to note is that Jay managed to achieve those concessions with almost no leverage because we had very little to give and almost nothing to force. And so he was able to achieve those concessions largely through his own diplomatic skill and a good relationship with British officials. And that's about it.
We need to take a break, my friend. Fascinating. I'm talking with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, has a book on Washington's cabinet, has a book on John Adams, and it's always a delight to talk with her. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about your man, John Adams. You're listening to a very special edition of Listening to America. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back, everyone, to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm talking with Lindsay Chervinsky. We, as an American people, have just, in the first week of January 2026, our 250th birthday, done a snatch mission into Venezuela in the Western Hemisphere, and the current president is invoking the Monroe Doctrine, although he garbled both terms of it. I think he said Dunroe document or something, but anyway.
Oh, no. This was intentional. Instead of it being the Monroe Doctrine, it is now the Don, as in.
Oh, so it's not a gaffe. It's like the Donroe Doctrine. So we had the Monroe Doctrine. Then we had the Roosevelt Corollary, Theodore Roosevelt, 1905. Now we have the Donroe Doctrine in 2026. All right. Well, there you go. I don't think that name is going to stick, but let's get back to John Adams. So Adams inherits the presidency. He said he was the heir apparent, and he's not Washington, but he feels great pressure over his head because of the celebrity and the place of Washington in American life. He keeps Washington's cabinet, which he didn't know better than he thought it was probably the right thing to do. It turned out to be a disastrous choice. France is really unhappy with us for a lot of reasons. And so in 1798, there's a quasi-war between the United States and France, an undeclared naval war, and the Adams administration has to respond. This is the foreign policy crisis of the Adams administration. So give us a little Quasi-War 101 here.
Yes. So as you said, there was no official war ever declared. The tensions really emerge when the American envoys were essentially kicked out of the country without being recognized because they refused to offer bribes, very embarrassing apologies, and agree to terms that were in violation of their instructions.
This is the famous XYZ affair that we've all heard about in grade and high school.
Yes, exactly. So that was the start of it. And kicking diplomats out of the country is one step short of a declaration of war. So there was an expectation that that would soon follow. And this was on the heels of years of French privateers and ships seizing American ships, imprisoning American sailors, selling off the goods, behavior that no sovereign nation would be okay with.
The French are not happy with the United States. They're very unhappy with the United States.
No, and Americans are increasingly unhappy with France, but the XYZ affair is really the straw that breaks the camel's back. So Congress responds by building up the naval forces, creating a naval department for the first time, which both Washington and Adams had been asking for since start of the federal government, well, frankly, since the Revolutionary War, but really since the start of the federal government in 1789. They increased funding for port defenses, and then they massively increased the size of the army in the event that France invaded.
There was talk of 50,000 troops at one point. It never came to that, but that's how crazy we were for a while.
Yes, and just for context, the size of the army prior to that had been about 2,500. So this is a massive explosion in terms of troop size. So over the summer of 1798, the country was basically waiting for the declaration. There was all of these defensive efforts. And when then the declaration did not arrive, there was a question of, well, would Adams ask for a declaration on the part of the United States? And by the time it was clear that France wasn't going to declare war, Adams had begun to become very uncomfortable with the army because he was basically forced to accept Alexander Hamilton as the number two. And Hamilton had very partisan plans for the army. This was basically a spoil system for the Federalist government, not the army like we have today. So he was very uncomfortable with the army. And he was starting to receive intelligence that France had really never intended to start a war. They thought the United States was weak and divided, and they could bully the nation into very favorable terms. When it was clear that that would not happen, they did a complete 180, and they promised to respect envoys that came to the United States. They wanted to engage in diplomacy. And so Adams began to tiptoe towards a diplomatic solution. He ultimately sent a new round of envoys. He nominated them in the spring of 1799.
Much to the chagrin of the Hamiltonian Federalists, who went nuts over this.
Complete outrage. They started to refer to Adams as an evil to be endured. It completely split the Federalist Party. To Adams' great credit, he knew that it would. And he knew that it probably was going to cost him his reelection. And he did it anyway because he believed that war would be horrific for the nation. He believed that, frankly, the army was going to be horrific for the nation if, Hamilton was allowed to have his way, and that a diplomatic and honorable peace could be secured.
All right, let me ask you a couple of questions. Let me ask you a couple of questions about this, Lindsay. Question number one. This was a serious crisis. You know Adams as well as anybody knows Adams. Did he think, oh, crap, this is the last thing I really want to have to face? Man, this is not why I'm president of the United States. I know how to do this. I can probably do this better than anybody else. But now I'm going to have to face this giant crisis, and it's going to be political. It's going to involve the military. It's going to be about bankrupting the nation. We don't have any business being in a war with Europe. What was his response when this was kind of thrust at him?
I think he wasn't all that surprised because Jefferson had said, whoever came after Washington was going to be left holding the bag. That's a direct quote.
Yes,
it was very clear. It's a great quote. It was very clear that tensions with both Britain and France were increasing. And so that foreign policy was going to be complicated in whoever was the second presidency's term. I believe that Adams thought that if anyone was equipped to handle it, it was him. And he, frankly, was probably right because he had served in London, he had served in Paris, he had served in the Netherlands, he had served, he had been everywhere that one would want to be and had a really good sense of how their foreign policy worked and what their priorities would be. And so I think he thought that of anyone, he was well prepared to handle it. And I think that he, even at moments when the call for war was most extreme by Americans, of course, sorry, Quincy just turned on my walking treadmill.
Ladies and gentlemen, there has been an interruption. The dog has gotten on. We now know that Lindsay has an under-desk treadmill. So, we're learning more and more about our friend, and the dog is wagging its tail. Lindsay is trying to control it. Control your animal. Control your animal.
He's uncontrollable, just like his namesake.
Right, so you were saying that, but I was going to say to that he also knew that he was a civilian. His background is not in war, and a civilian really is the best person to try to sort our way through this, because our Constitution is very direct about this, that the military must be subordinate to the civilian authority.
Yeah, so he thought he was the best person to handle the diplomacy. If there was going to be war, he was nervous about that. And again, that was sort of the framers' expectation, that you want to have civilians in charge of diplomacy. The other thing, I think, there was this massive rally around the flag effect in the spring of 1798, and boy, did he enjoy the popularity, because that was not something that he usually got. But he always questioned whether or not war would actually happen, because he said, how is France going to send 30,000 people here? Like, they're off fighting a war against other nations. They don't have a navy to transport the troops now. They have a lot of other...
Atlantic Ocean.
It's a pretty big Atlantic Ocean. They have a lot of other demands on their troops. And the United States supplied most of the food for the French Caribbean colonies, which were largely given over to the production of sugar and cash crops, which were done through enslaved labor. And so they needed food. So you don't want to start a war with people that are providing a very important resource for your empire.
All right, fair enough. Question number 2, maybe a short answer on this one. Jefferson thought that the speech that Adams gave was a warmongering speech, that it was hysterical, that he stirred this thing up unnecessarily. Did Adams, for a short time, kind of get caught up in some sort of war fever that he soon sobered up about?
A little bit, but not as much as Jefferson thought. Adams was never actually interested, I think, in war. He was interested in the popularity that came with the threat of war. And to his credit, he didn't actually know if the declaration of war was coming. France didn't really appear at that moment to be acting in a sensible, rational fashion, and so he didn't know what was coming next. So I do think he got a little bit wrapped up in it, but never as much as Jefferson thought.
All right, so number 3, this is a little bit harder. Take the time you need for it. If there had been no Hamilton, so if there had only been Henry Knox and the others, but Hamilton was not a factor, I don't think this crisis blows in the way that it did. So Hamilton, we know his first letter, Ned, I wish there was a war. He thought that war was a form of glory seeking. He thought that his destiny was to be a great strategic warrior. He forced Washington to make an ultimatum to Adams about all of this. And Hamilton made it clear that if he got authority and he didn't go to France or didn't have to fight the French in the United States, he might make a march into the South, and he made it clear that this was designed to intimidate the Jeffersonians, the agrarians, the Virginians, and so this is a really, really reckless thing that Hamilton is trying to do, and he used the enormous connection he had with Washington to make Washington humiliate President Adams, for which Adams never really got over. If you take Hamilton out of this picture, this is a much different story, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating counterfactual. It is a very different story. I think if Hamilton is out of the picture, a couple of things happen. One, I don't think you actually have an army that was the size that it was. Hamilton was ginning up support with his allies in Congress to expand the size of the army. So I think that came from both directions. But certainly Adams would not have been as quick to try and undercut the army. I think he would have pursued diplomacy either way, because I really don't think he was interested in war, and I don't think he was interested in being a war president. But it probably wouldn't have unfolded exactly the same way, and he maybe wouldn't have been quite as quick to send new envoys.
And Hamilton wound up damaging Adams' relationships with the great Washington. And I think that's really unacceptable. And all of you who love the musical, just remember that Alexander Hamilton was going to use an army to march through the domestic sphere of the United States to intimidate the political opposition, that this seemed to him to be the right thing to do. Fortunately, John Adams was way shrewder than that. But I hate when people, I get the musical's brilliant. Hamilton is a brilliant man, a colossus, said Jefferson, the greatest financier. of the era.
He was also nuts.
But he was nuts, and he had this kind of war craziness and this honor craziness, and he did some really terrible things. And so did Jefferson, of course, but Jefferson is not a war man. All right, so as you said earlier, and I don't want this to get lost, but we'll go on here in a minute to Jefferson, that Adams took an enormous political hit for sending a second diplomatic team to France. I mean, essentially the end of his president. He's going to be a one-term president almost certainly because of this, and he knew it, and he did it anyway because he believed that it was the right thing to do. And then he put up a little plaque in the White House saying, hey, that's what I did. That's how I want to be remembered. And I think you and I both agree that was one of the greatest acts of true statesmanship in American history.
Yes.
And so that this is really, really matters that Adams, you think of any recent president having the capacity of courage and character to say, this may be the end of my presidency, but I'm going to do the right thing, irrespective of the politics, because I'm not going to just let myself be browbeaten into an unnecessary war that would probably cripple our economy and we might even lose.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the most recent thing that I can think of, and it's different because of the outcomes, is Ford pardoning Nixon. You know, Ford pardoned Nixon because he believed that the nation needed to move on and it wasn't going to survive if they didn't. And that was, you know, enormously controversial. He probably knew it was going to cost him his reelection. It made him immediately unpopular. It was intensely controversial. Now, I think there's a lot of disagreement in retrospect about whether that was the right course of action, whereas I think there is sort of universal historic agreement that avoiding war was the right course, and that the Treaty of Mortefontaine for Adams, the Treaty of Mortefontaine which was signed in October of 1800 with Napoleon, was a marvel and was really important to American history. But that type of political courage, we just don't see all that often.
Just quickly, you don't think that Ford's pardoning of Nixon was a bargain?
I don't think it was a bargain. No, I think Ford was
statesmanship. Yeah,
I think Ford was a genuinely good man, and he did what he thought was best for the nation. And I think there's some questions in terms of the repercussions for the presidency and the legal system and our institutions since then, but I don't think it was a bargain.
So, Lindsay, we're out of time, so I'm going to skip over the embargo. But 1807, 8, and 9, Jefferson and Madison cook up a full economic embargo, nothing in, nothing out, because they don't want to get ground up in the Napoleonic Wars. Turns out to be, it probably makes a certain kind of sense in the abstract, but it was a political disaster, and they wound up having to water it down. And the first thing Madison did was get rid of it, and it also led to the War of 1812. So, you know, Jefferson believed that there must be a peaceful alternative to war. And he and Madison had been enamored of embargoes and economic coercion all their lives, and it failed. So, but I don't want to get stuck there. We can do a full program on that. I'm surprised that Jefferson left office in some disarray, but still, let's talk about Native Americans for 2 minutes. The Constitution calls them not taxed. They're not us. They're something else. And in the famous Marshall Trilogy, he said they're dependent domestic nations. So they're foreign nations, essentially, although they're within the larger aegis of the United States. When we talk about foreign policy, we have to sort of talk about this for a minute. None of the presidents really knew what to do about this. But at the end of his life, George Washington wanted to do something better than what was unfolding. And it just never panned out, did it?
No, it didn't. And it's hard because the native nations that were quote unquote outside the American boundaries, if you think about, like, especially the nations that were in the Southwest long before white American settlers were there, they were major powerhouses. I mean, just like massive empires, not in the European sense, but in their own right, and really shaped how other nations operated, how the Spanish Empire operated, how the British Empire operated, how the French, how the Americans. And yet, by the time American settlers sort of took over certain nations, so if we're looking at the nations in the Southeast, or certainly in the old Northeast, they do kind of become this dependent group that has to be both respected and protected in a way that just was not going to work while the federal government was small and weak and relatively powerless, or at least not willing to put its political power behind that protection.
And George Washington said that to prevent white, land-hungry frontier settlers from invading native lands would have taken a China wall, that there's no democratic regime like ours could possibly stop this migration of land-thirsty European-derived people. And so some historians say this was inevitable. I always want to resist any myth of inevitability. There were moments when we could have done something more principled, but it's a tragedy. And Jefferson plays a huge role in this. Washington gets better marks. I think Adams doesn't have a lot to do with this, I don't think. But Jefferson basically sets in motion a benign form of what Andrew Jackson would consummate in the Indian Removal Act and subsequent removals. But Jefferson's view, more benign, was we'll just convince them to move west. We'll pay them a little money. They'll want to be like us. By the time we finally reach them, they'll be like us, and we'll amalgamate. And so, talk about fantasy. But it's a sad story, and I think that we'll do another program on the foreign policy with respect to Native Americans, because this was a bloody business in the Ohio Valley and in Kentucky during the administrations of Washington, particularly, but also Adams and Jefferson.
Yeah, I agree. We should also do 10 things on the embargo, because I think that there is a lot there.
Do Indian policy in the West. Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, Happy New Year. You're going to be in such demand in 2026. It's going to be really oppressive, but what a great thing for your career. We all love you. And for all of us who are listening, we'll see you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.